In the 1850s, the United States government constructed federal buildings across territories that had barely been surveyed. Courthouses in Kansas, land offices in Nebraska, custom houses along rivers where trade had not yet arrived. The official story is straightforward. These were investments in future growth. The government anticipated westward expansion and built accordingly. But the Erie Canal was completed in 1825 for a population of 600,000 along its route. By 1835, it was moving 4 million tons of freight annually. The infrastructure had been designed to handle capacity that wouldn't be reached for another 20 years. In Manchester, England, the 1877 town hall seated a municipal government that administered fewer than 8,000 registered voters. The building contained 26 committee rooms, a grand hall with a 12-ton organ, and vaulted ceilings that rivaled cathedrals. The population it served was a fraction of what the architecture seemed prepared to govern. These weren't isolated decisions. They followed patterns. This is a documentary examination of observable facts. We are not claiming conspiracy. We are not presenting conclusions. We are walking through publicly available records and asking why certain decisions were made at the scale they were made. What follows is an investigation into timing, capacity, and institutional architecture across the 19th century. Between 1840 and 1890, the United States federal government constructed over 400 post offices, courthouses, and custom houses in towns with populations under 5,000 people. These were not small buildings. The 1858 U.S. Custom House in Charleston held vaults designed for import documentation on a scale the city would not process until the 1920s. The building's foundation used over 3,000 granite piers driven into reclaimed marshland. The second floor featured a rotunda with 40-foot ceilings and load-bearing arches engineered to support an archive weight the building would never carry. Charleston's import tonnage in 1860 was less than half of what it had been in 1840. The infrastructure anticipated a reversal that did not occur. In 1868, the General Post Office opened in London. It processed 642 million letters annually. The sorting hall was designed with conveyor and pneumatic systems that could handle 2 billion pieces of mail. That threshold was not reached until 1952. The building had been engineered for demand 8 decades in advance. There are practical explanations for this. Governments plan long-term. Buildings are designed with expansion margins. Civic architecture often includes symbolic ambition alongside functional need. But those explanations require a level of forecasting precision that conflicts with how urban populations actually grew. Philadelphia's population in 1850 was 121,000. By 1860, it had grown to 565,000, a nearly 5-fold increase in a single decade. No census model predicted that. No administrative planning document survives that projected it. Yet the city's 1848 municipal complex had already been designed with chamber capacities, office layouts, and vault storage that matched the 1860 population, not the 1850 reality. The timeline doesn't align with incremental planning. It aligns with construction that assumed a future administrative load before the population existed to justify it. In 1867, the British War Office completed a building in Whitehall with 1,100 rooms. At the time of construction, the War Office employed 408 staff members. The building was designed to house a bureaucracy 3 times that size. By 1880, the office employed 1,340 people. The architecture had anticipated the expansion 13 years in advance, not as a vague allowance for growth, but as a precise spatial match. The same year, the U.S. Treasury completed construction on a wing designed to store silver certificates. In 1867, silver certificates were not yet in circulation. The legislation authorizing them would not pass until 1878. The vault was built 11 years before the policy existed. This is not about mistakes or inefficiency. These were expensive, complex projects. Granite and marble were transported hundreds of miles. Foundations were engineered into bedrock. Labor forces numbered in the thousands. These buildings were not symbolic gestures. They were functional designs built to specifications that had no matching reality at the time of construction. and they appeared across unconnected regions within the same narrow decades. Boston's 1862 Custom House included cargo processing bays for a volume of international shipping the port had never handled. By 1875, the volume matched. Liverpool's 1857 St. George's Hall included court chambers designed for simultaneous sessions that would not be legally required until the Judicature Acts of the 1870s. The architecture preceded the institutional structure it was meant to serve. Not by years, by decades. There are records of these projects. Contracts survive. Architects are named. Construction timelines are documented. None of this is hidden. What's absent is an explanation for the mismatch. Why did administrators in the 1850s and 1860s approve designs for bureaucratic functions that did not yet exist? Why was load-bearing capacity built into structures for weights that were not being processed? Why were processing systems installed for document volumes that had no legal framework? Standard historical interpretation attributes this to optimism, ambition, and long-term planning. But optimism does not explain precision. And long-term planning does not explain why the future arrived exactly as the architecture had predicted. Not approximately, but structurally, spatially, and operationally. The timing is too exact. By the 1880s, municipal governance across the United States and the United Kingdom had settled into near-identical administrative templates. Registry systems, tax collection frameworks, postal sorting hierarchies, court dockets. These systems were not legislated into uniformity. They emerged through parallel adoption across cities that had no formal coordination, and the buildings that housed them had already been constructed. Not during the system's formation, but before it. The Erie Canal project began in 1817. The route stretched 363 miles through wilderness, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. At the time construction started, the combined population of the towns along its proposed path was approximately 150,000. The canal was built 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Its locks were designed to handle boats carrying 30 tons of cargo. Engineers calculated capacity for 500 boats per day moving in both directions. In 1817 there were no boats. There was no cargo demand. The towns the canal would connect were agricultural settlements with populations under 2,000. By 1825, the canal was operational. Within 3 years, it was moving 400 boats per day. By 1836, traffic exceeded design capacity. The canal required immediate expansion, not because the design had been inadequate, but because the infrastructure had anticipated a commercial demand that materialized faster than any population model predicted. The design had not planned for gradual growth. It had been built as if the demand already existed. In 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad began construction westward from Baltimore. The population of Baltimore at the time was 80,000. The railroad's initial design included rail bed grading, bridge foundations, and switching yards engineered for 12-car freight trains moving at coordinated intervals. In 1830, the railroad owned 4 locomotives. Freight coordination systems did not exist. There was no regulatory framework for scheduled rail traffic. By 1850, the railroad was operating exactly as the 1830 infrastructure had been designed to support. Switching yards built in 1832 were handling traffic volumes that had been dimensioned for 18 years earlier. The infrastructure had not been expanded to meet demand. The demand had grown into pre-existing capacity. This was not isolated to one railway. Between 1840 and 1860, the United States constructed over 30,000 miles of railway track. Much of it was laid through territories with populations under 10 people per square mile. The rail beds were graded for double-track capacity. Bridges were built with load ratings that would not be utilized until the 1880s. The standard explanation is speculative investment. Railroads were built in anticipation of settlement and trade. But speculative investment does not explain uniformity of engineering standards across uncoordinated projects. It does not explain why rail gauge settled at 4 feet 5 inches across dozens of independent railway companies before any federal standardization law existed. It does not explain why bridge load capacities, built in the 1840s, matched the locomotive weights that would not be manufactured until the 1870s. The system had been designed as if the future rolling stock was already known. In 1845, the United States government began constructing federal land offices across the Michigan and Wisconsin territories. These offices processed homestead claims, land patents, and territorial surveys. At the time of construction, fewer than 12,000 homestead applications had been filed nationwide. The land offices were designed with filing systems, vault storage, and clerk stations capable of processing 60,000 documents annually. The Homestead Act would not be signed until 1862, 17 years later. By 1870, the land offices were processing the exact volumes they had been designed for in 1845. The administrative infrastructure had preceded the policy that justified it. In Britain, the same pattern appeared in water and gas systems. London's 1855 sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette, included 82 miles of intercepting sewers and pumping stations engineered to serve a population of 4 million people. London's population in 1855 was 3 million. The system was not expanded. It was built at full scale and left dormant until the population grew into it. By 1890, the population reached 2 million. The sewer system required no structural modifications. It had been built 35 years in advance, not as an overestimate but as an exact match. Manchester's 1848 gas distribution network followed similar logic. The pipeline grid was designed with pressure regulation for 180,000 household connections. In 1848, Manchester had 48,000 households. By 1875, the system was operating at design capacity without infrastructure expansion. The network had anticipated a demand that did not exist at the time of its installation. Across the United States, grain elevators appeared in the 1850s and 1860s along rail lines that were still under construction. These were not small storage buildings. They were vertical industrial complexes with capacities measured in millions of bushels. The 1862 elevator in Buffalo, New York, could store 1.8 million bushels of grain. In 1862, Buffalo's annual grain throughput was under 400,000 bushels. By 1880, the elevator was operating at capacity. It had been built 18 years early, not approximately but precisely matched to a future volume. Chicago's 1865 grain elevator system included 9 facilities with a combined capacity of 12 million bushels. Chicago's 1865 grain receipts totaled 3 million bushels. The system was designed for a trade volume 4 times larger than what existed. By 1885, Chicago was processing 12 million bushels annually. The elevator system required no expansion. The infrastructure had been constructed not for present conditions, but for a specific future state. The same logic extended to administrative systems. In 1867, Britain's Reform Act expanded voting rights to approximately 1.5 million additional men. Polling stations, ballot counting facilities, and voter registries had to be established nationwide. But the facilities already existed. Civic buildings constructed in the 1850s, before the Reform Act was proposed, included rooms designated for voter registration and ballot processing. The layouts matched the administrative requirements that would not be legislated until 1867. In the United States, the 1868 14th Amendment extended citizenship and voting rights. Census infrastructure, registration systems, and federal documentation frameworks had to expand to accommodate millions of newly recognized citizens. But the warehouses, filing systems, and processing offices had been constructed in the early 1860s, before the amendment was ratified. The administrative architecture had anticipated the legal structure. There is no single explanation that accounts for all of this. Individual cases can be explained through optimism, forward planning, or speculative investment. But those explanations weaken when the infrastructure proves not approximately useful, but operationally exact. When a building designed in 1850 functions without modification in 1880, it suggests the designers knew not just that growth would occur, but how it would occur. What systems would emerge? What volumes would be processed? What administrative hierarchies would form? That level of foresight conflicts with the unpredictability of 19th century growth. Urban populations doubled, tripled, or quadrupled within single decades. Immigration surges were erratic. Economic panics disrupted trade. Political reforms were contested and delayed. Yet the infrastructure remained stable, not because it adapted, but because it had been built to match conditions that had not yet formed. By the 1880s, the administrative frameworks governing municipal operations in the United States and Britain had converged into nearly identical models. Tax collection, postal sorting, legal documentation, land registration, all followed parallel structures. And the buildings that housed these systems had been standing for 30 years. They had not been retrofitted. They had not been redesigned. They had been waiting. The term Tartaria appears on European maps between the 15th and 19th centuries. It was a geographic label, not a unified empire, but a European designation for the vast territories of Central Asia stretching from the Caspian Sea to Siberia and into parts of northern China. Cartographers used it as shorthand. It covered regions controlled at various times by Mongol successor states, Turkic Khanates, and Russian expansion. By the early 1800s, as colonial mapping became more precise, the term faded from official use. That is the historical record. In recent years, the term has been reinterpreted. Online communities have adopted Tartaria as a framework for questioning 19th century infrastructure. They point to the same timing mismatches, the same over-engineered systems, the same architectural precision we've examined here. For some, Tartaria has become a theory of a lost civilization. For others, it functions as metaphor, a way of naming the feeling that something about the official timeline does not fit the physical evidence. There are three interpretive models. The first is standard historical consensus. The infrastructure we've discussed represents ambitious but conventional planning. Governments and private investors built for anticipated growth. Some projects succeeded. Some were over-optimistic. The precision of certain designs is coincidental or exaggerated by retrospective observation. The second interpretation suggests institutional inheritance. The administrative systems and architectural templates of the mid-19th century were not invented, they were redeployed. After the disruptions of the Napoleonic Wars, the 1816 year without a summer, and the social upheavals of the early 1800s, European and American institutions rebuilt using older, pre-existing frameworks. The buildings were not designed for future demand. They were reconstructed to match inherited capacities from earlier systems that had been disrupted or lost. The third interpretation treats Tartaria not as a literal empire, but as a narrative placeholder for whatever preceded the mid-19th century institutional reset. It suggests the physical infrastructure we attribute to 19th century construction may have been repurposed, reoccupied, or adapted from an earlier period. The construction records document renovation, not original building. None of these interpretations is provable from the evidence alone. Each fits portions of the observable pattern. In 1816, volcanic eruptions in Indonesia lowered global temperatures. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine, migration, and economic collapse followed. Governments reorganized. Populations relocated. Administrative records were re-established. Within 30 years, the infrastructure we've been examining was in place. Institutional systems that appeared suddenly in the 1840s carried a level of organizational sophistication that typically requires incremental development. Registry templates, postal hierarchies, legal documentation standards. These systems emerged in parallel across disconnected regions without centralized coordination, and the buildings that housed them were already standing, built, according to records, within the same compressed time frame. The official narrative presents this as rapid industrialization, a period of explosive growth and innovation. But rapid growth does not explain architectural precision. It does not explain why so many systems appeared ready-formed rather than iteratively developed. It does not explain why the infrastructure built in the 1840s and 1850s required no significant modification for 40 years. Tartaria is not an answer. It is a label for the discomfort created by these observations. Whether it refers to a literal predecessor civilization, an inherited administrative framework, or simply the psychological friction of encountering infrastructure that feels older than its documented age, the term functions as a way to hold the question open. The evidence invites examination. The courthouses built for bureaucracies that did not yet exist. The railways graded for traffic that had not formed. The grain elevators designed for harvest volumes a generation away. The sewer systems dimensioned for populations not yet born. Each of these can be explained individually. Together, they form a pattern that resists simple resolution. We are not claiming conspiracy. We are not presenting a hidden truth. We are observing that the official historical timeline contains friction, places where the infrastructure and the documented demand do not align. That friction does not require a dramatic explanation. It may reflect incomplete records, misattributed construction dates, or planning methods we no longer understand. But it remains. The buildings are still standing. The records are publicly accessible. The timeline is documented. And the question remains open. Why was so much built before it was needed? And why did the future arrive exactly as the architecture had predicted? The evidence is there. The interpretation is yours.